Welcome to Innovations in Education. I'm your host, David Adams, CEO of the Urban Assembly. And on this show, we bring guests every single episode who have made things work in public education. This show is about the innovators. This show is about the folks who are solving problems. This show is about making things work in education. Now, there's a lot of shows out there talking about what's wrong in the education systems, and those are great shows. There's some shows talking about what we're not doing well, and there's a lot to learn from those, but that's not this show. This show is going to be featuring educators who are making things work for young people and improving public education. Well, folks, we're here with a very special episode of Innovations in Education. Now, typically I'm focused on the K-12 sector, but today I have a very special guest, Dr. Shaun Carver. Now, Shaun, you were appointed by the board of directors as the executive director of International House of the University of California at Berkeley in August of 2020. This is not our typical K-12 space. We're actually moving into our higher education space. And that's because you've brought a wealth of experience to this position. You've worked internationally, places like Beijing. You've served as the executive director of the Holt International Business School. And you've worked in places all across the world, thinking about the role of international education and what it means to be educated domestically and abroad. We usually talk about K-12 education here on the show, but we're really excited to have you here, Shaun, to talk about your role in international education and what it means to be educated in that context. So welcome to the show, Shaun. We're very excited to have you today.
Thank you, David. It's a pleasure to be here.
Now, Shaun, your background has been focused all over the world, but we're here to talk about UC Berkeley, where you lead the International House. What is the International House?
Yeah, it's a good question. So, the whole International House movement started in 1908 when a man named Harry Edmonds was walking down the steps of the Columbia University Library in New York. He passed a student on the stairs, and as you do, you say good morning. And the student kind of stopped and gave him a strange look, which sparked this conversation between these two. The student said, "I'm from China and I've been in the United States for 3 weeks, and you're the first person to talk to me." So Harry and his wife Florence decided to invite international students from New York into their home for Sunday supper. And what happened when they started becoming, introduced and sharing their thoughts and their ideas with these international students was fantastic. And from this grew a community, which turned into the concept for an international house, which John D. Rockefeller Jr. funded in 1924 in New York City. So the first I house is up there in Morningside Heights, I believe, up by Columbia University. 6 years later, came to Berkeley and opened the second one here. And there's also a third in University of Chicago.
There are 3 across the country. Did I get that right?
3 across the United States, yes. There's been other I houses that have opened up subsequently, but the 3 original Rockefeller houses are fairly unique because of our size, because we're all, independent institutions with our own fundraising, our own boards. Chicago's a little bit different, but, our whole purpose for existing isn't just servicing international students. And in my house here, we have 620 postgrads and undergrads. We also have, about 20% domestic students, along with 80% international students. And in that international population, I have 82 nationalities represented in this house. So it's extremely diverse. And it goes back to that original mission, which is, when different people come together with good intentions and open minds and want to learn from each other, really great things happen. And so you just talk about K through 12. I think there's a lot of things that we learn by building this diverse community and bringing different people together in productive and positive ways that can apply to a lot of the K-12 community now, where they're dealing with a student population that can be very diverse, either economically, socially, even internationally.
Well, Shaun, this sounds great, but the question arises, why should public dollars, especially state universities like yours, be used to support international students when we have a lot of students domestically that need high quality education?
I mean, that's such a good question. It really comes down to what's the value of diversity in a classroom? Do you want people that bring different perspectives, different ways of thinking, different values into a classroom so that you can have a much broader understanding of issues? If you believe that there's a right and a wrong, and I'm right and you're wrong, I don't need you in my classroom. If you come from a little bit more developed view of there's a lot of different opinions out in the world, there's not always the right and wrong. There's a lot of gray areas. And if we really want to be critical thinkers and we want to teach critical thinking, then you need to have diverse opinions in a classroom. You need to have a civil environment where people feel safe to share their views and to have discussions, being open to listening and understanding others. And that's just in a classroom. We're attracting the best and brightest folks from around the world that come in, get our education, support our research, support our local economies. International students are, first of all, they're paying, two or three times the tuition of a domestic student. They're renting apartments, they're buying food, they're buying technology, they're contributing to the research that, is coming out of our universities. We could go on and talk about the benefits of international students in our education system and how important that is today. We're in this technology race. It's not the arms race anymore. It's an AI race. And instead of us bringing the best and brightest from the world in areas that our education system has not been globally strong in, we're really, tying our hands behind our back in a period where we really need to be leading the world and not following the world in these new technologies.
Now, Shaun, we are in a political environment that is not necessarily conducive to the vision that you just put forth. I notice you use the word diversity. I notice you use the word civil discourse and those concepts. These are not ideas that are really prevalent in how we're thinking about specifically higher education or K to 12 education. And what would you say to folks who believe that diversity is not a strength, who believe that we should take care of domestic students first, and who want to put international students to the back of the line with regards to receiving high quality education in our country and beyond?
Yeah. So I'm a Californian, although I've traveled around quite a bit. California is my home state. I met my wife when I was in China. Both my children were born in China. When I'm here and, paying a pretty high tax to live in California, I want to have the benefit for my children of, one of the best university systems in the world, which is University of California and the Cal State system.
Mhm.
At the same time, to be the best environment for learning, it needs to have a diverse opinions in the classroom. And I would like my son and daughter to make sure that they are exposed to a wide range of views and they're global citizens. I can't change the fact that this is a global world now. And as much as we want to isolate ourselves, and especially when you look at what we're doing with tariffs and restricting trade, it's even more important now than ever that people have a global understanding that these aren't necessarily our enemies. They're people and countries and governments that are trying to do the best for their people. At the end of the day, we all just want to have opportunity. We want to have a safe space to raise our families. We want our values and our cultures respected. And these are things that, we've been preaching this since 1908. So we've been through cycles where after World War II, isolationism, the nationalism that have come, we've ridden through all of this
Mm.
and been, this has been our mission for a lot longer than just the current administration or the current view.
It's a grounding notion to be able to look at history through cycles, right? This idea of understanding how things ebb and flow and maintaining our value set, regardless of the situation that we're in today, because tomorrow we may be in one of those ebbs and flows. That's something that's deeply resonant with me. And as you talk about over 100 years of dedicating yourself to diverse perspectives and being educated through those diverse perspectives, I think it should give our listeners something to believe in, that some things stand the test of time.
Yeah, when we were founded, Rockefeller came here and he donated the building to the University of California. In the same gift, he dictated that the organization needed to be outside of the university structure. And the reason for that is because the issues we were dealing with at the time were too politically sensitive for the University of California. My house here in Berkeley desegregated Berkeley. The area that we're in, which is right across the street from the campus, was surrounded by sororities and fraternities that were segregated. This area was redlined. And here comes Rockefeller and Edmonds, buy the property right in the middle of this neighborhood and builds a house and says, I'm going to bring, 500 international and domestic students, men and women living together. I mean, these were things that were unheard of in 1925, 26, 27. And so the community protested us, not in our neighborhood, right? There's a place for those people and it's not in my neighborhood.
Mhm.
And Rockefeller and Edmonds said, no, this is how we see the world and we're going to move forward. We're building this for the future. So, I think you're right. I always think about the pendulum is always swinging back and forth. And, we are in, we quickly went from one side to the other side. But, throughout this pendulum swinging over the last 100 years, iHouse has been, and our mission has been very straightforward and very clear that, having an open mind and understanding other people and understanding their views of the world is a good thing. Even if you disagree with someone, understanding them leads to a better result than not understanding somebody, labeling them, and then trying to destroy them. It's not a path forward. It's never been a path forward. And we're going to, stay true to course as we always have. that, diverse communities can work. When they see each other as peers, when they have open minds, when they listen, they want to learn, and people want to share, not necessarily convince, at least this mutual understanding and mutual respect. That's really important.
Let's talk about your background in Beijing. You're not just thinking about these ideas, you're living them. What can we learn from Beijing's approach to education? And what has Beijing tried to learn from an American approach to education that we should be proud of?
Yeah, this is like a daily conversation with my wife, who obviously is Chinese and, came from a Chinese economic system and looks at our children and say, well, they're not, their peers in China are 3 years ahead on math than
Hmm.
teaching in their school. And so, she's, has a different view. I came from the US system, which, where we look at critical thinking, we look at arts, we look at, a broad set of outcomes for our higher ed. It's not just all about science and technology and math and being great at that. It's allowing people to kind of find their strengths and supporting that. You can't look at China's education without understanding a lot about their history and the culture and how that's, really shaped the Chinese education system. You have 1.4 billion people, a billion more people than the United States that you have to educate. And you have to somehow, when you have a limited higher education system of universities, how do you create a system that is fair and equitable for the best and brightest to get in and not the wealthiest to get in? And, that's a challenge. And so nationalized tests, for as much as we hate them, is one way that you can make sure that, you have a equitable way of sorting people out into who has access to higher education, who has access to trade schools, who has access to job training. That's some of their challenges. Plus, historically, these national tests, that goes back thousands of years in China. So it's just very much part of the culture. And, they invest a lot and put a lot of weight into rote learning. You have to teach a lot of people, basic skills. And the best way to do that is to just rote learning. Here's what you need to know. Let's learn it and then regurgitate it. And not a lot of critical thinking in that model for a lot of reasons. They don't encourage, critical thinking so much. These things come together to create a system that creates, the people who are really strong in certain areas, but maybe the trade-off is maybe less critical thinking, less in creative industries, although obviously things are a lot different now than they were, 60, 70 years ago.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of things you said there, I think, that are interesting. The notion of the problem that the public education system in China is solving for is sorting versus empowering. I think that's an interesting kind of
Mm.
notion. We talk about the notion of democracy, the notion of what it takes to have citizens who are self-governing. We talk about Dewey and the organization of public schools in the United States that are intimately related to this notion of self-governance. And then I think as you talk about a different problem set, which is how to get the right people into the right solutions. And I think that sometimes your perspective here kind of encapsulates some of the tensions we have in the US as well, as you have some areas of our country saying, hey, I just want people who can do math and do science and read well. And then you have a larger conceptualization of education that's saying, can people solve problems? Can people have critical thinking? So it's been interesting to me to think about how we create people who can not only support our economy, but support our democracy, the tensions that creates. And then we look at China, this idea of being innovation driven and innovative, but that putting pressure on the political system, right?
Yeah.
Which is asking for folks to comply.
Well, think of this. I always found my world, there's not right and wrong. There's just different ways of doing things. And it's usually as an outcome of your value system, your culture.
Mm,
So one of the things, China noticed, especially as they started going through this economic rise that they've been going through in the last, 30, 40 years,
sure.
is that, families with wealth have the ability to hire tutors and do specialized training to give their kids an advantage. That won't come to a shock to anybody that people that have money have the resources to support their kids and give them a leg up.
Mm,
So what does China do is they start limiting the ability of people to take extracurricular courses and extra training courses that gives them an advantage because that's not equitable. And
mm,
it's folks that on the lower end of the economic scale are disadvantaged. And so, when would we see our government actually install a policy that would, level the playing field
mm,
for economic issues like that?
mm,
They recognize how damaging social media is to children. So they mandate limits on the amount of social media that children can have access to because it's distracting them from their schoolwork. And so it's a government that sees the importance of education and is not afraid to make policies help create a healthier environment, focus on education, even when there's an onslaught. I mean, we have so much research about social media and how destructive it is to the classroom. Thank you,
Hmm.
New York, for limiting cell phones and
We're still working on it.
thank
Yeah.
you so much. I get that done. But also, you start seeing suicide rates of,
Yeah.
especially in young girls. I mean,
Yeah.
we know what these things do. Why aren't we doing anything?
Yeah. It's interesting to me. You talked about rights and wrongs as opposed to problems to solve and different approaches to solving those problems. And that's been something that's been inspiring to me. And I want to go back to this notion of what it means to have diverse viewpoints in the classrooms, because I think what diversity can generate is the opportunity to see things from perspectives and from assumptions that are not obvious to the folks who are in those cultures. So I've spent about 22 years in the military, trained with folks across the world from Taiwan. I've trained from folks from Yugoslavia, former Yugoslavic Republic, trained from folks from Kazakhstan. And one of the things that's been always interesting to me is the things that I assume are not obvious to folks from different parts of the world. Like the fundamental assumptions around, oh, the nature of the public education system to empower self-governance versus to sort for opportunities. That's not only changed in the United States, but it's not always obvious to folks in different places because they're solving for different problems. So I just want to come back to this idea of bringing people together from diverse viewpoints in order to put pressure on perspectives in order to then develop a deeper sense of what we believe and why. So I just want to come back to the International House. We moved from Beijing. You gave me a
Yeah.
sense. Now we're back to UC Berkeley in California. What does that process look like? How do you put people together intentionally to create tension and viewpoints and value conflicts that can help kind of deepen our understanding of what we believe?
You would think, if you listen to the narrative today, a house with 80 different nationalities, we cross economic boundaries, national, religious, gender, everywhere that you can create diversity is in this house, living together in close quarters, dining together every night, every lunch, every breakfast. They're studying together, they're socializing together.
Mm,
Think it's chaos, and it's, we're constantly violent in this house. And it is the opposite.
mm,
We intentionally create an environment where there is no dominant culture. I said the domestic students are 20% of the house. That's the biggest cohort. The next down is, I think, China, about 9%, India is 8%, France
mm,
is around 7, 8%. And so these 82 nationalities, nobody feels comfortable in this house. No one feels like
mm,
my culture is the right culture. If you're sitting at a dining table, you're surrounded by 5 or 6 other countries that have a lot of different opinions. They're asking you questions because, just like you were saying, you're curious, you don't understand, like, what is it like in your country? How is this done differently? And you're having these conversations that make you understand that people do things differently, and that's okay. I came from the business school world before coming into International House, and there's tons of research. Diverse teams perform better because you have more diverse opinions and ideas and suggestions, things that you wouldn't think of yourself. Only comes because people are different than you and come different perspectives and different ideas. Diverse teams perform better.
mm,
All these things that we believed in, and have been developing disappeared. We've now gone back to, no, outsiders are just trying to destroy us and destroy my way of living.
mhm,
That's not what the United States was ever about, right? I mean, diversity used to be the norm. Zero generation folks were welcome here. First generation folks were welcome. Now we have second, third generation saying we don't want immigrants here. Where does that come from? How do we get to that point where, we want to close our walls off to everything that's made us who we are?
I think that one of the things that is hard is when we look back at history, we look at the viewpoints that won out. And I think we forget the conflict within the spaces that generated these positive outcomes, right? It has not been easy for the United States to solve the challenges it's solved. And Neil Postman talks about this notion of one of the challenges that the United States sought to solve is, couldn't we create a cohesive society with a diversity of viewpoints, religious spaces, and even ethnicities at the time, which was one of the more ambitious problems that a country could ask itself to solve.
Yeah.
And I think we as a country believed in that question. And I think we continue to believe in that question. It's just that the pendulum, as you mentioned before, has shifted to those who are more skeptical of our belief in doing stuff that's big versus folks who want to feel comfortable. You mentioned this, and I think it's an interesting concept that nobody in your organization feels comfortable. People are outside of their comfort zones because that's where learning occurs. And so let's just go back to this idea, because this is not just a question of the current administration, the current age. We've struggled with integration across our country since Brown versus Board. We have struggled with segregation across our country since Plessy versus Ferguson and earlier than that. And so my question here is around this notion of energy. Entropy says that everything always evolves into its constituent parts. And so without energy, things fall apart. How should we be thinking about organizing energy towards this vision of a community in which we all have a part, but nobody is necessarily dominating?
Yeah, it's interesting that all of the things you talked about were 50 years after the founding of iHouse here, in Berkeley. And, we were desegregated by policy. I mean, when you bring international folks here, we got all races, in this house living
Mhm.
together at a time where that was not the norm.
Yeah.
And, it took us, 40 years later before we even started addressing it, on a national level. I think one of the things that I benefit here at iHouse is that people self-select to be in this environment. They can choose to go to a campus housing or, an affinity house or a sorority or fraternity that matches their values or a co-op. People self-select because they want to be in a diverse environment. They want to be around people who are different than them, that have different opinions. Otherwise, they wouldn't choose to live here. They'd be very unhappy if they came in here with a fixed mindset of, this is my way of life and you should be following it. I think it starts with, creating individuals that have that open and curious mindset. And that's something I think we've lacked in a lot of areas. A lot of people is that there's folks who don't value the diversity of the United States anymore, want to claim ownership to it when this was a diverse, from the very beginning, this was a very diverse country from the 1700s on. As the Europeans started to flood in here and the Asians and everyone started to come in, I think the ownership was in the ideal of a diverse country
Mhm.
where people could get along. We've respected freedoms. We've respected differences of opinions, freedom of speech. And now we have groups that are trying to own the concept of the United States to go forward with their view of the
Yeah.
world, whether it's religious or economic or, social, whatever, and not embrace the complexity, the beauty of the complexity of the United States. So, I mean, these are such huge issues, right? And long issues, but it is frustrating right now when you see people that are just closing off and trying to change the United States, not necessarily to be a more open and diverse, welcoming people from around the world because they can have opportunities here and freedoms here that they can't get at home. A lot on the plate there.
Let's stick to that for a little bit. Obviously, you spent some time abroad. I'd like to go back to that time. What should Americans know about America as it's seen from abroad? We talked about this before. When you are in a space, you know your space, you know your warts, your strengths. But when you're outside of space, you start to reflect. It's like when you go to somebody else's family and you're like, oh man, my family is interesting in this way that I would never have guessed because I live in it every day. In this time where you noted that there's a backsliding in terms of our values around diversity, e pluribus unum, and out of many, we are now one. This notion of we the people, a more perfect union. What can we learn from looking at America from outside America, even in the education space?
How unique the United States is, traveling throughout Asia, which is predominantly where I am from, but also my mom's British and I spent a lot of time in Europe, traveling around. This concept of diversity, US is very unique with the amount of diversity that is within our country. We coming out of, George Floyd, there was a lot of DEI work that we wanted to do. And it was, I would say it was really focused from a US context of diversity and the issues around race.
Yeah.
I have students from Africa and from Asia that have their own issues that aren't necessarily around race and maybe ethnicity. The concepts of DEI doesn't resonate to international students the way it does sitting here in Oakland, California
Hmm.
or Berkeley, California. And so we had to look, how can we talk about these really important issues in a way that the globe can understand, the world understands. And, if you're from Africa, talking about George Floyd and racial issues in the United States, it doesn't resonate. They got their own issues that they're dealing with that aren't necessarily around race. The same thing with India. I mean, they were throughout the world. Everyone is struggling with some sort of inequality. And,
That's
how do we find a solution that applies everywhere, not just to the United States? Not that we've come up with any solutions on these issues as a nation.
You said some really important things there that really resonate with me. One, I don't know that people recognize the breadth and the diversity of the United States of America and our ambitions around that, to your point. We're often compared with nations, peer nations, are much more ethnically homogenous than the United States. Even actually looking at Singapore and the way they've approached education as a cultural and intellectual approach, right? It's not
Yeah.
just about how well you do math, it's also about taking multiple identities and ethnicities that make up the city state and then organizing the education system to create some narrative. And
Mhm.
just to your point, in Singapore, we've had some visits from them, the host culture and the host language, and then the language franca, as it were, in terms of English. These are conversations
Yeah.
that the government has had to try and think about, how do we take multiple ethnicities and create a common identity around what it means to be Singaporean.
Yeah, I mean, there are countries. Singapore benefits from a lot of things. One is its size because it's essentially a city state
Hmm.
versus trying to, create a national education system in the United States that has so much diversity from West Coast to East Coast, from the North to
Yeah.
the South. Yeah, it is an idea that, this is a country made up of, it's Chinese, Japanese, Malaysians, so much diversity that are in that country that they couldn't exist if they picked a side and decided we're only going to go with one. You have to create a multicultural view of the world and education to make sure you're not excluding folks. One of the things I've been talking about recently is the importance of free speech. Like, I can't label anything hate speech in our house. There's extremes that, we try to put guidelines on. You can't threaten people. Having a point of view that I disagree with isn't necessarily hate speech.
Hmm.
And so coming in and saying, you can't talk about this, or I take a side in any global conflict, whether if it's Russia and Ukraine, if it's the Middle East, if I take a side as an organization, I'm excluding a significant part of my community. It goes against what we're trying to do. My goal isn't to take a side and make a statement that I support this one or I support that one, but to get a peaceful solution, we have to come together. We have to understand where we're coming from, where the other person is coming from. We have to, have the respect of, like, I don't want to eliminate you. I want a peaceful world. And to do that, we got to move forward together.
Hmm.
And so it means we have to find solutions that work for all of us, not just one of us. And you can apply that to any issue that we're dealing with, which is ask questions, try to understand the other person, try to understand the other side, have empathy from where they're coming from,
Yeah.
open minded, and then come together on a solution and do it in a civil way. We've lost civility. It's this intellectual arrogance of, I'm right, you're wrong, and you don't deserve to even be around. Like, and we're going to cancel you or remove you or kill you to get rid of that view of thought. And that's never, in the history of the world, that has never worked out well for anybody.
So you're using some important language here, right? You're using language around cancel. You're using language that's, I think, reflective a little bit of some of the left's concerns around words as weapons prior to the current administration. And you're also extending it to the current administration vis-a-vis their emphasis on perhaps limiting the kinds of speech that make people feel uncomfortable. So I feel like you're leveling a critique here from both sides of what it means to create expression through the idea of the free exchange of ideas.
I'm a bit older. So, I remember back in the day where, having a Democrat or a Republican or an independent as a friend just meant that it was more interesting conversations. It wasn't my enemy. I wasn't out to convince them of anything. We would have really, I don't want to say intellectual because I'm not that intellectual, but, we'd have interesting conversations where we would, challenge each other, push each other. And it wasn't seen as a threat or hate speech. It was just trying to understand and advocate and debate, but in civil ways.
Yeah.
And we've lost all of that.
Yeah.
That we don't want to sit down with someone with a different viewpoint, whether it's left or right or rich or poor, and have a conversation about our beliefs and why we feel that way. And we definitely don't want to be in a conversation where we feel challenged. My early debate days in school, when you're getting challenged and you're uncomfortable because you're not super strong in your position, that's hate speech. I'm uncomfortable. I'm going to leave. And it's like,
Yeah.
okay, well, this would be an opportunity to really rethink, reevaluate, and find a way to come together. But, I believe in free speech. I think most people believe in free speech. What comes with that is you're going to be offended. At some
Mm.
point, you're going to be offended, and that's okay. I have my kids, I have some pretty radical, conversations with my kids about ice cream flavors and, what they like isn't what I like. And that's okay. We
Yeah.
can work through it. We can get past it. And I hope as we get older and if they have views and opinions differing than mine, we can work through it. We can talk about it and we can come to a place where we can come together and find solutions that respect all of our opinions.
So we got to break this back down. You lead the International House at UC Berkeley. Your students self-select into this environment. Ultimately, this is a show about K to 12 education. And so what does it take in your vision for our K to 12 system to produce young people who are willing to feel uncomfortable across difference, who are willing to have conversations with folks they may disagree with, who have done enough self-knowledge that they have a sense of why they believe what they believe, who may be a candidate for the International House, the I House, who will be somebody who might self-select into an organization like yours for their 4 years of post-secondary education?
Yeah, I think the qualities that are important. First, empathy. You have to be able to put yourself in someone else's shoes and understand where they're coming from and why they feel that way. The second is, curiosity, being critical thinkers, like understanding that there are multiple views of issues and try to understand the different views and then form an opinion. Don't form an opinion and then, side with one group or another. Understand there's diverse views on all of this stuff.
Hmm.
We were talking about the other day, we were talking about the Middle East and, it's not just pro-Palestine, pro-Israel. There's a lot of folks in the middle that maybe be pro-Israel, but not happy with the way that the war is being conducted or the things that they're doing. There may be people that are pro-Palestine, but don't agree with Hamas and how Hamas is leading and the decisions they're making. There's a lot of gray. And then there's people in the middle who don't know enough about this issue, don't know enough about the history, or don't understand either side because they've never sat at a table and had conversations.
Let me just be clear. So have you never had a fight at the I House for folks over political or values? Did nobody ever throw fists? Or is that something that happens and you're working through negotiating what it means to make amends? I just want to throw this out because we got to be real with each other.
Yeah. Well, so look, I look at 100-year history, right? And there
Okay.
were times, we have really great oral histories. I'm kind of a historian of my organization. So I read through all these histories and certainly India and Pakistan during that period. That was very disruptive in the house. Iran was a big issue in the house, as they were removing the king.
Yeah.
There was a lot of disruption in the house. We were in the middle of the free speech movement here in Berkeley. The civil rights movement was here in Berkeley. And my people, my residents, my alumni, they were out there supporting the good work, right? But they didn't come into the house and start banging on people's doors and chasing them out. You're not welcome here because you have a different viewpoint. These were, they came into the house and see them as peers. They see them as friends. They see them as part of the community that have a different view. And so they work it out. They have conversations over dinner in civil ways. And so, with all the conflict that's been going on, I've been here 5 years. So I started the COVID year and then ever since. So there was a lot of things that we were dealing with were conflict. The house handles it in really productive ways. They would go down last summer and voice their opinions and be part of the protest down on campus. And then they would come up and they wouldn't tear down people's flags. They wouldn't, write nasty things on their doors. I would say there's always some outliers. There's always, a percentage of the community that is kind of negative and disruptive.
Like anywhere, right? Yeah.
Well, I think there was Alan Simpson was a senator, I think, from Wyoming at one time. He said, 10% of any population, whether it's an organization, a church, or government, are crazy, lunatics, unreasonable people. I say we have less than 10% in this house that are those folks.
It's a lot. I mean, to imagine that folks could come together from different backgrounds, different faiths, different ethnicities, different genders, and find common purpose. I mean, that may just be the American dream in space over in Berkeley, California. I mean, it may just be what we believed our country to be able to live up to in our highest values, encapsulated in a house of
620.
620.
Yeah. I was just in New York City last week, and you walk through and in San Francisco or LA, and you walk through Koreatown, Chinatown, Japantown, you're like all of these, as the world came to the United States, they were also segregated into their own communities, but there was some sort of mixing between those communities and respect between those communities. And I don't think anyone was trying to, and this is maybe a really Eurocentric kind of viewpoint, but I don't think anyone was coming to create their home country here in the United States. They came to the United States to get away from something and to come towards opportunity. And I think that's kind of the narrative today is that these immigrants, however you classify immigrants, or it could be international students, it could be people coming across the border, it could be people who are just, trying to become naturalized citizens here. that they're trying to convert the country into
Mm,
their way of life. And you're certainly hearing that narrative in Europe as well right now.
mhm,
Uh,
mhm.
and that mindset is never, you know, that is, I think, the threat to this idea of diversity. No one in my house is coming here to create their culture. They're coming here to be in an environment where their culture is respected, but also everybody else's is as well. You mentioned earlier, I'm kind of like, criticizing both sides here. Well, welcome to my world. That's, I'm not trying to criticize anybody. I'm trying to find out how we can all be right and how we can all move forward together.
Mhm.
When I was in China and I was teaching economics in China, there were things I knew I couldn't say in the classroom. I had a textbook removed because it had Taiwan as a different color than mainland China. So books got to go. There were things that I knew if I had spoken about in class or provided my opinion on in the classroom, my visa would be revoked and I'd be sent home. And so, and certainly if I had created violence or started to protest a violent protest on the campus, for sure I would have been out of the country.
Yeah.
So, I'm looking at some of these issues and I want due process, of course. I want, there needs to be more transparency on this. But you look what was happening at Columbia University last year. Everyone, even international students, have a right to free speech, but not to take away civil rights of other people or to restrict other people having access to their job or their classroom.
Mm,
Certainly not to be violent or to destroy public property. That's not what we protect.
mm.
We want diversity. We want people to come and have their opinion. But I have to say, as much as I love international students, coming here and destroying property, taking over campuses or shouting people down and intimidating them, you're a guest of this country. As we travel anywhere in the world, we're guests of those countries.
Mm.
There's certain rules that we have to follow to remain a guest in that country. But at the same time, we shouldn't be revoking because of what they have to say.
It's a very complicated tension that you just put forth, right? Because humanity has had a long history of this idea of what it means to be a guest in a space and how to acquire not just hospitality, but full rights in a space. Are we perpetually guests? And again, we got to know this. I think one of the ways that America is unique is in this notion of how to become an American and who can become an American. And it's changed, obviously, in racial spaces, it's changed in terms of ethnicities. But at our best, there's been an idea that an aspiration to the American ideal can bring you to the American dream. It's not who you are in terms of your physical kind of spaces, but what you believe. That this is de Tocqueville, right? And the notion of how America came to be a country and a creed and a people. And I think it's a difficult dream to aspire to. And I think we've had strengths and challenges along the way, but I'm inspired by the things that you're talking about and the values you're upholding in the iHouse around bringing people from different backgrounds around a narrative of communication, around a narrative of shared belief, of a notion of a common thing that we are trying to accomplish together. You said, I want to get to the most right for the most people to a certain extent. And that just takes effort. So in our last kind of 2 or 3 minutes here, Shaun, I want us to kind of think about what are one or two lessons that the iHouse has worked through, some insights that are applicable to the rest of our society, noting that our society is not necessarily volunteers in this experiment of the American dream.
Yeah.
They were born into it. So what can we learn? And then just connect that back to public education for me. What can we learn about what you guys are doing? And what does this mean for our K-12 space?
Yeah. One of the things that we found out, and, I did my doctorate, I did my research on iHouse alumni and what they perceived were the things of this experience that made them more culturally aware, whether it's K through 12 or higher, it's education. We like our frameworks. We like our learning objectives. We like, going in here, we're going to get them from A to B and here's how we're going to do it. We do those things here as well. We have formal courses and certificate programs on intercultural understanding, cross-cultural conflict and things. And most of them feel like their learning comes from this, what we're doing right now, just having a conversation, chatting with someone different, with a different viewpoint and
Yeah.
listening and understanding. That's where it comes from. And so as much as we like to say that we have this incredible program that we install it here and we can put it anywhere and it's going to have this great outcome like iHouse has. In the end of the day, it's a bunch of like-minded people, like-minded meaning they're open to other ideas. They're open to exploring. They're curious to learn about other people and understand other people. And then it just happens organically. Just, they make friends. And they have conversations, and some of them are difficult conversations late in the night. But they walk away with a much better understanding and an openness to the world of like, this is a beautiful place, this beautiful planet of so much interesting things out there. Go travel, go try new food, go listen to different music, go, appreciate the history of some of these incredible civilizations and open your mind. And so, a lot of it just happens socially, not academically, not through programming. And the more we can get different people just together in social, fun ways, good things are going to happen. You put them in a cage when it's a fight to the finish, nothing good is going to come out of that. But, get people in a party, get them at a dance, get them having coffee, sit down and have a meal like they did in 1908 and start being curious, create that environment wherever you can, as much as you can, and watch how fast things change and how fast things break down. All this conflict breaks down. And I think once we have that, then we can work together on finding solutions to our social and economic problems and racial problems that we're dealing with. It's not me against you. It's not us versus them. But it's all of us in this together. And most people want to see equity. They want to see a fair world. They want to see society healthy. And I think there's more of us than the opposite of that. So
inspiring vision. We talked a lot about today what it means to run the iHouse. We talked about the history of the iHouse. We talked about your own background and what education looks like in different countries like Beijing and the United States and what we're solving for. But ultimately, I heard us talking about communication, a sense of belonging, and putting people together on the dance floor, if I got that right, in order to create the foundations for making the world a better place. I appreciate the work that you're doing. I appreciate your focus on bringing students from across the world into community, into a common narrative. And we look forward to thinking about what we can do in the future to make that dream a reality.
Thank you, David. It was a pleasure.
Thanks for listening to our latest episode of Innovations in Education, where we bring education leaders who have made things work in the education sector. If you like this episode, please subscribe so that you can hear more great content around innovations in education. I've been your host, David Adams, and have a great day.